going in to Overwatch 2, players who did not play Overwatch 1 are going to have to play 100 games to gradually unlock the heroes that were in Overwatch 1. This is Blizzard's first time user experience, something that it seems they've put some thought into, and I think there's some value to this. I and many other people have been critical of how poor Overwatch's tutorial is for really ramping people up for how to actually play the game. They really gave us, okay, here's Soldier, play him in training range for a couple minutes, you are good to go. So this could be better. Now, for it to be good, it's going to need some more depth to it beyond just unlocking heroes in a specific order, but we'll take what we can get for now, and we might explore that and what it should have in another video. So what I wanted to do is put out what I think the order of those hero unlocks should be. No, I do not have inside information of what the unlocks will be on October 4th for new-time players, but here's what I think it should look like. So in our first tier, we've gone ahead and unlocked 4 DPS, 2 supports, and 2 tanks. Remember, we're playing Overwatch 2, so this is a 2-2-1 setup. So we look at this, and here's what we've got. We've got in our DPS categories that same intro character that they gave us, Soldier. If you've played any sort of FPS game, this is a very familiar hero. He plays like an FPS hero. We have Reaper, who is probably the simplest of the flankers. I want something resembling a flanker involved so that we can have sort of an evolution path for our flankers, but he's probably the simplest of them in that he can be played with core to decent value. Junkrat, well, that's a pretty obvious evolution path where we're looking at that. That can evolve into other poke type heroes like Pharah. We definitely want to be playing Junkrat before we're playing a Pharah or some of our other later poke heroes. Okay, makes sense to me. And then we have to put Bastion somewhere. I'm a little conscious of how spam and poke heavy this is and how ugly for tanks this could feel, so I'm a little bit worried about that, but I think unfortunately some of those spammy heroes, some of those meh heroes are some of the simplest heroes to play, so they are going to end up in our first tier where you're going to have to play 15 or 20 games or something before you unlock the next tier. Okay, then we move over to our supports, and you have to have at least 2 supports available in that first tier because if you have 2 brand new support players, they both have to be able to pick a hero. And I've put Mercy and Zen here, and part of this is to intentionally drive people away from feeling like we have to always have a stupid super amount of healing. This is actually sort of intentional, where we've got something that's a little bit more balanced, a little bit more technical, where we have this Mercy Zen. And this might feel weird if you look at the tanks I've selected and that Mercy Zen is really going to struggle to keep up a Reinhardt Zarya tank line. But remember, this is Overwatch 2. You only get 1 tank. It's a lot easier to keep up a Reinhardt with 2 supports than it was in Overwatch 1. That's just sort of reality. The Reinhardt is bulkier. There's not a second tank that's soaking heals, that sort of thing. And it's really not very hard at all to keep a Zarya up who's playing at all reasonably in Overwatch 2 with this support line. So I think this works out perfectly nicely. Mercy basically had to be a first-tier support pick, and really the only other support tier pick that could have been here with her that arguably could have made sense is Moira, but Mercy Moira is kind of not engaging for a player if they're a support player and they're going, okay, this is what I have, but I have FPS skills, that sort of thing. We don't want our supports to get early trapped in this mindset of what I do is heal, and healing and healing and healing is support. So I kind of like what we have here. Then we're going to go ahead and move on to our second tier here, where we've unlocked some things for each role. We've got Cassidy, makes sense, slightly more complicated Soldier, not as forgiving with edge or sprint. Tracer, we've got to fit Tracer somewhere. Tracer's been on the box art. Tracer is iconic for Overwatch. Yes, Tracer is an extremely deep hero, but I don't think we can hold Tracer until that last tier of 100 games. I think we want to let people who are picking up Overwatch 2 play with her, perhaps to their regret, perhaps to our regret, but play with her early. Hanzo is probably the most complicated of the more permanent, or most simple of the more permanent, more seriously usable projectile heroes that you can go deep into the game with. Unlocking him in the second tier makes sense to me. And then in our sort of technical category, we're coming out with Mei. Mei, definitely going to work. She has some poke to her, another sort of projectile here, so we've got a balance of 2 hit scan, 2 projectile. She's got those walls. I think this is going to make sense pretty early. Then we're bringing in Moira and Brig. If this this was Overwatch 1, I might put Lucio here instead of Brig, because Brig is actually fairly complicated to get right in Overwatch 1. She's a little more forgiving, I'd say, in Overwatch 2. The extra range on her bash, she's a worse hero than she is in Overwatch 1, but the extra range on her bash, sort of what you're trying to do with her, it's a bit simpler in Overwatch 2. I think this is the appropriate tier for her. Moira can go here. Now you have your first big real healer. Makes sense to bring Moira in before we bring in other big healers like Bap, Anna, that sort of thing. Fine with me. We go over to our tanks. Orisa, at this point, is another brawler. Didn't really want them to come into play in the same tier as Reinhardt, because then you're sort of picking, what do I do? Instead, it's sort of an evolution. It's a little bit more complicated. How are you going to balance your cooldowns? That sort of thing. And then we have Winston, who is opening up a new playstyle for us with a more mobile tank, our first tank with some serious mobility there. But still much simpler than, say, a Diva or a Wrecking Ball. Seems appropriate to me. So now we move on to our third tier. So at this point, people are halfway, a little more than halfway through their unlocking for these first-time users. And now we've got some heroes that are getting to serious levels of complexity. So here we have Ashe. Okay, that's another poke hero. Makes sense. Another poke hit scan. Cool. We have Sombra. I think we'll be happy that Sombra's not someone immediately available to people, since Sombra tends to be a bit low on damage, a bit technical, isn't really the person that you want people going, this is my first tier and I'm just going to stick with it forever. You want people used to how much damage is actually expected to come out of a DPS hero before they have access to Sombra, so that they notice themselves when playing, this is a little bit less damage that I'm used to. So I'm going to have to be seriously getting other value, or you can hope. Pharah, that makes sense. I don't think we want Pharah too crowding up the early stuff. It made sense to have Pharah sometime later than Junkrat. Hanzo, in some ways, simpler to understand than Pharah. Let's go ahead and bring in the Pharah. Plus, if you have a lot of new people going through the first-time user experience together, like you will at the beginning, you have a decent collection of hit scan heroes available to people by the time Pharah is available. Our first-time user is going to end up in situations where you have someone who's on game 60 and has Pharah, and someone else who's on game 1 and only has Soldier and Bastion. Absolutely you are, but at the beginning, this gives a little bit of help here. Then we move over to Sim. Again, this is sort of our more technical hero tree here. Sim fits that. Could Sim have possibly fit into the game a bit earlier? Yeah, she absolutely could have, but we're doing 4 heroes per unlock for our DPS. This seems like an appropriate place for her. And we don't want to have too many of the tanks have a terrible time heroes all in the first tier. We're already a little heavy on that with Reaper, Junkrat, and Bastion, even though Bastion is different in Overwatch 2. We certainly didn't want to bring too many of these tanks have a bad time thing in too early. We don't want a tank shortage in Overwatch 2, even though I think there's much less concern over that happening with the one tank and tanks being stronger. We move on to supports, and Lucio, as I said, makes sense for him to come in. He's a bit more technical. You've got the wall riding. You have a harder to use weapon. And then Bap. Bap is another big healer, so sort of is going to be the potential upgrade that you could be looking at from Moira here. Makes sense to me, and we definitely would want Moira to be available before Bap. Then we move on to our tanks. For this tank tier, we're going to need 3 of them. Just works out with the number of tanks that we have. Sigma, bit more of a specialist tank. Wouldn't want to unlock him in the first tier because you wouldn't want to be stuck on him as your only tank choice. He's really at this point best in poke v poke stuff, so we're getting into our more specialist type tank heroes here. We also have Wrecking Ball. Wrecking Ball's probably more complicated to use, definitely a higher level of higher to get access to the hero than Winston. We're going to have this in our third tier. And Roadhog, I'm going to admit this is up here because we don't want to have a ton of Roadhogs running around. I think most people are going, hey, if we could have less Roadhogs running around, that would be great. He's not amazing in the one tank world. He can be used as like a counter pick, maybe against a Doomfist or a Winston, something like that. But you don't want too many of this running around, so we'll have him come into play a little bit later. Especially because we don't want people going, this is what tanks are in that first tier here. And then we move on to our final tier. And this final tier is going to include all of the new heroes, Sojourn, Kiriko, and Junker Queen. Part of the reason for that is you actually want to let the players who are coming over, there's already going to be enough demand for these heroes. People who played Overwatch 1 are going to want to play these new heroes, and they don't have a whole cast of new heroes to them. They only have 3 new heroes. So it makes sense that these would unlock later. Okay, fine. Obviously, Kiriko, people would have to unlock through the normal path, so maybe she doesn't even make sense to be here, but Sojourn and Junker Queen in theory would be available, so whatever. I put Kiriko here just sort of for completeness. I suppose you wouldn't actually unlock her with the with the first time user experience path, though maybe in the future players would. So we move on to this. We've had a nice little progression through our poke heroes here. We're on to Widow, who is going to be the hardest to get initial value out of the poke heroes. If you can't find value, you have to be able to hit your shots on Widow. If you can't, she just doesn't work. Much lower barrier to entry on Soldiers, Castes, and even Ashe, who at least you're getting TNT value out of. Then we move over to our flankers. We're putting Genji sort of in this last slot here. I think that's appropriate. He's probably the hardest of them to use. You could say, oh, but Sombra's, got that lower damage. He's very technical, that sort of thing. Or, oh, Tracer has so high of a skill cap. It's higher than Genji's. I understand those arguments, and I don't hugely hate those arguments, but in terms of getting initial value out of the heroes, getting to that basement of value, I think you're going to find that Tracer's basement of value is a little bit lower than Genji's, so that works out here. Sombra versus Genji. Genji is more complicated to play. They're both very challenging for new players to get value out of. Then we move on to Echo. This is down our Pharah path. It's down a projectile path in general. Makes sense to us. Echo is the most complicated and the newest of all of these projectile heroes. She makes sense to be here. Torb is actually relatively challenging now for the more technical heroes in that his projectile is relatively hard to hit with. He's become a more complicated hero. The era of Torb, simpleton, put down your turret is mostly over. For these first-time users, hey, the turret may still be a great source of DPS, best player on the field, but you know what? We're sort of working with the reality of the hero there. And then we have Sojourn. Sojourn would fit here even if she wasn't a new hero, in that she has a hit scan weapon to go with her projectile weapon, as well as having her slide and her E. That's a lot of things to work with, and I can tell you that a lot of players are going to struggle to go, I'm doing projectile and hit scan on the same character with the same thing, different weapons. That's hard for a lot of people. This is probably the right place for her. Moving over to our supports, Ana is probably more complicated to use than BAP there. You're looking at the sleep dart, and that's going to be more punishing if you don't make that work with aim, compared to what you're looking at with regenerative burst, which is just a timing of, hey, can you get it at the right timing to get the double burst of health from it, and lamp, which is, again, that's just a timing thing. So we're looking at that. Ana's going to be the more complicated ones of them. Fine, Kiriko probably doesn't actually belong here, but whatever, would actually be later still because you don't get her with the first time user experience path. And then for our tanks, D.Va is another matchup specific hero there at this point, where you're sort of using her as an anti-dive hero with poke in some of these situations. Okay, fine, no big deal. You don't need her as an early unlock, and she is more complicated to play than Sigma. So we'll put her in here. Likewise with Doomfist. We've seen Doomfist in metas in Overwatch 2 professionally be somewhat interchangeable with Winston, but I would say he is the one that's going to take a little bit more practice to get to that value basement on. And then Junker Queen does belong in this latest tier as well, in that how she protects her team with her shout is a little bit complicated to get value out of, as well as really getting value out of that right click. So I think there's more that Blizzard would need to do. I hope they have good tutorial stuff for the first time user experience, but this is the order that I would have heroes unlock in. What about you guys? Do you look at this and say, no, it should be a completely different order? We should have Moira in the first tier maybe, or Ana and BAP should switch, or Sim and Mei should be up in that first tier of DPS, Tracer should be in the bottom tier of DPS. Let me know what you think, who you'd move, or what your full order would be in the comments down below. If you're enjoying the content, drop a like, consider subscribing for more Overwatch 2 stuff. This one was just for fun. Let's see how it compares to what happens on release. Thanks. Temporal out.